right, welcome everyone. We are live. Be your host, Dr. Ernesto Custodio, and I am joined today by Peter Borsella. Peter and I have had many of these live sessions now coming to you, and we decided to join forces again to have a session on large or extra large product backlog management. Peter comes to us via Winnow Management. Peter is a distinguished, going back as far as the initial days of Scrum as a trainer, and of course, coaching organizations on Agile transformations. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Ernesto. It's good to be back. Good to see you again.
All right. So let's get right to it, Peter, because this is a hot topic. A lot of folks have a lot of questions about how do you work with a very large product backlog, and whether that be the idea that we have individuals that could be dealing with a product backlog that is large by the fact that their product is simply very large, or that we have individuals that have a small product or just have a product backlog that is significantly larger because it's out of control or it's got too many things that we want to put in it, whatever the reason that might be. Many organizations today, multi-team organizations, scaling organizations, individual team organizations are struggling with keeping their product backlog lean. Tell us why that's an important topic to keep in mind, Peter.
Well, I think to preface that, I think what you started with is very important in how we answer that question. Why is this a significant topic? The Agile movement, understandably, has set a tone that indicates your product backlog should be a little tighter, right? It shouldn't be very large, and there's some logic behind that, right? Why would you have a product backlog item that's a year and a half out on the calendar? It takes up time, it takes up room, takes up space. If you view inventory from a lean perspective, right, inventory is wasteful. I view the product backlog as inventory. It's waste, right? It takes time to produce, it takes time to maintain. So again, understandably, someone looks at a product backlog and sees an item that's like a year and a half out and questions like, why do we have something that far out? So you brought up an important point. First category of situation where you might have a large product backlog is you have such a large endeavor in front of you that it requires us to project further out. And I know that could be uncomfortable for some of our Agilists, but you could have product backlog items that are part of milestones or roadmap items, right? That might be 2 years out. I mean, think about if you're building a physical product. You can't just go month by month, and see how it plays out. You have to expect some things further out in the calendar because you have to coordinate with other areas like supply chain and manufacturing and things like that. So projecting that far out might make a lot of sense because that's just how big your endeavor is. And then the other category that you talked about is your product backlog is large because it's out of control. Now, why is this an important topic? Well, come back to my theory about lean inventory management. If you're the product owner or the product manager of this, how are you going to manage that product backlog if it's so large that it becomes unmanageable? Right? So we need to come up with some techniques, some considerations for both of those cases. The case where I need 2 years worth of product backlog items, and the case I'm drowning, my product backlog keeps growing, and I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts came to mind as I was here listening to you, and being a little real about what we normally hear out there. And tell me if this sounds familiar to you. Meeting with an organization sometimes and asking to take a look at their roadmap to understand how that is connecting to execution. And the answer sometimes, not often, but sometimes you get is, well, we don't have a roadmap, we're agile.
Right. Exactly.
This idea that being agile to some people is misinterpreted as we don't have a long-term horizon. We are taking things one sprint at a time, and therefore we don't have a plan past that. What do you think about that?
Well, now I don't mean to be humorous about it, but it does sound kind of funny. If you're in an environment where you have an unlimited budget and no specific delivery time frame, then have at it. I mean, most of the organizations I work with, there are some constraints on how much money we have to spend and how much time we have. So if you're in a pure startup environment where you have investor capital coming in, and yeah, you're just taking a sprint at a time. Let's see what we should do next. How does this look? Like a lean startup type model. Yeah, then maybe, right? Then maybe that makes sense that you don't want to project too far out. Matter of fact, I worked with a company here locally in South Florida where they were involved in a technology that was so new that it seemed quarter by quarter they were changing their mission objective because they had a certain service they had created and they market tested it, and like, oh, it wasn't quite generating the feedback they expected, so they had to kind of mold that and reshape that and start heading in a different direction, and they learned from that, et cetera, et cetera. So in that case, yeah, there was no 2-year deadline. There was not even a 9-month deadline, and the money was quarter by quarter based on investors, right? So yeah, in that case, maybe that's okay. Most of us are not in that situation. Most of us are in situations where we have objectives that we're trying to accomplish within some of those boundaries. So why does that come about? Why does that idea of, well, hey, we're agile, we don't need a roadmap? Why? I think it's because we've understandably and legitimately embraced that need to shift, to pivot. And we're understandably concerned. Why would I spend hours upon hours projecting a couple of years of work out, an investment of my time to create that inventory? Why would I do that if my experience is telling me, but every quarter I'm reworking it anyway and it gets thrown out? So I do see that there's a place for it. You know, in most businesses, I think that's going to be more rare, right? To find that pay as you go and figure it out, right, as you go.
I like that term, pay as you go, because that's sort of what it feels like, right? You're going to be purchasing the next sprint, if you will, and we'll worry about the other stuff later. And there is an element of that. I don't want to completely dismiss that, because refinement is precisely about that concept that, hey, look, why don't we take a Pareto approach to this? Why don't we look at the top 20% of the items that are closest to us? Let's work on refining that. Let's get into understanding the how and the what for these items. And the other 80%, we're going to eventually move that window into that zone 80% at a time, and we'll continue to refine. But as it turns out, a large percentage of those items that were in that bottom 80% don't ever make it to the top. So we would have wasted our time. We would have wasted effort, investments, dollars into getting something so well understood, but never got to do the work. So what we want is to focus on that top 20%. And I'm throwing out a number because the Pareto proportions show up all over business nature and in our daily lives, and that it makes sense. But what we really are looking for is just enough to have clarity into the next set of sprints that we're going to be doing. But that does not mean that we don't have a roadmap. That does not mean that we don't have a direction. That doesn't mean that we don't have larger coursed items that will eventually be refined.
Right. Right. And I think that, that can somehow connect with, like the 5 levels of planning, right? The idea that you start with the high level picture, the vision, let's say, of what you're trying to accomplish. And then you come in and like, okay, well, what's something that's an achievable goal over the next 6, 12, 18 months? And then within that, right, you look at something like a PI or a quarter, right? And what makes sense for the coming 1 or 2 quarters. And that quarterly projection is based on the other layers that are around it. It's not in a vacuum.
I I like that, and I think we're sort of hashing out the why this is important. We're going to get to the how. I promise
Hmm.
our audience we'll get to some techniques on these as well, because we know that there's an appetite for understanding how we coach and implement these things. So if you have any comments or questions, you are more than encouraged to go ahead and comment. We are tracking that. Our team is on the other side feeding us some of this. So please go ahead and ask away and comment away. And I think, Peter, coming back to the topic, we've sort of defined the agile approach, right? This idea of being agile is being able to pivot as we are getting closer to the execution and what drives the most value. Eliminating waste, you mentioned that, right? That's a lean concept where anything that's not benefiting the customer is actually considered waste. How much of that can we reduce our processes to be able to do more customer centricity related work? And on the agile aspects, the why is this important? Well, this might sound like I'm preaching to the choir, but we've are very familiar with this idea that agile projects simply succeed a larger amount of times than traditional projects. And it's for this very concept of being able to inspect and adapt on the latest items, right? So at a rate of a success rate of 42% over 26% when you compare it to more traditional waterfall type of phased large planning approaches that are going to give us an entire plan for the year in all of its details, that is just shown to be a not efficient way of going about projects. So if we shrink that planning into the most relevant iterations, we actually have a higher success rate. So I just wanted to put that out because numbers are important to some folks in demonstrating what we're putting into context here. Okay?
Yeah, good point. Because maybe balanced with the size slash timeline, balanced with that is what flexibility do we have as we encounter new information? Some of these cases where we're projecting really far out, I think, Ernesto, think about like a government contract. In some cases, the customer is not behaving in a very agile manner, and they're going to tell us what we're supposed to be delivering in year 2 and year 3. And we still want to take advantage of the opportunity to bring visibility into early and frequent deliveries to encourage the customer to see possibilities of maybe doing something different than what they originally projected. But we also know in some cases they're bound by some higher level demand that's telling them, no, this is what you're going to do,
Yeah, you brought up government, so let's bite on that just at least once, right? Because they're a very good example of these large product backlogs and large products, and what we're starting to see are groups or entities like the Air Force, right? The Kezi Run analysis that show that larger projects, something along the lines of 8.5 years, were significantly less successful than shorter projects. At a clip of 10% success rate for larger projects and 76% for smaller projects. That's a whopping number. That's an amazing difference. So even government institutions are beginning to realize the value of smaller being better.
Yeah, if you
and I like to preface that with yep. Please go ahead, please.
Oh, I was going to throw a couple of other numbers at you. The Standish Group, right? they've looked at thousands of projects over many years. A lot of it's software, and their research indicates that on a software project that is going to run 3 years, you planned out 3 years worth of work, the odds of you successfully delivering that is practically zero. Now, successful means on time, on budget, all expected features delivered. Okay, but who's to say that if you changed expected features delivered, that wasn't a good thing?
Fair enough. Fair enough. I recently came across a very, very interesting report that showed a very large number of projects, 160,000 projects gathered and analyzed. This is a Rally report. So Rally took all of its software data and anonymized it and analyzed it, and they came up across some very, very interesting numbers that I think are relevant to this as well, right? The idea of estimating versus not estimating. We'll talk about that. But it also had to do with the success rate of projects. And it does have, it does support the Standish Group findings as well, which does illustrate that simply short-term planning is more effective, right?
Yeah, so Ernesto, you're familiar with the I'm sorry, I thought you were finished. Yeah, so
go ahead, Peter. It's all yours,
like
please.
the investor model of budgetary planning, right? So even if you have something that's 3 years, projecting out for 3 years, fund it for a year or fund it for a quarter, and then look at the results and then decide, okay, what are we going to invest in next for the next quarter or the next year, as opposed to just going through the whole 3 year expecting that your estimates, right, are going to hold up for such a projection. Ernesto, you got me thinking, should we, because you mentioned estimates, I know we have to figure out where to fit that in. We want to make sure we don't leave anybody behind. Should we talk a little bit about, like, what's the basic expectation of the product backlog anyway?
I love that. Let's rewind a little, or let's back up a little. And for those that might not be as familiar with the subject that we are talking about, Peter, please give us the ABCs of the product backlog.
Well, I'll give you my interpretation, and you might have a different interpretation, Ernesto. So I like simple. I like keeping things to the smallest number of variables possible. I'm very simple in my thinking, right? The fewer variables, the better. So I like to go back to like original Scrum product backlog thinking on this. Now, regardless of what Agile practice you're using, most of us understand some of the basic concepts of a product backlog. It's a list of things that we want to see delivered. Here's what I'm looking for, Ernesto. I'm looking for 3 things. I'm looking for, on each line item, a description of what's being requested. Now, that might seem pretty obvious, but what I mean by that is common language description, right? Something that the people involved and the stakeholders involved, they can understand, right, what it is that we're talking about. So description, an order to it, a little different. It's very close to priority, but a little different if I wanted to nitpick, right? Because the order has to do with numerical sequencing. This is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3. And the third thing I'm looking for.
To close that argument there, I think that's a very, very pivotal point, because the difference, and I'm just finishing your statement for those that need to connect the dots. When you are providing a priority ranking, you could have 2 number 1, but when you have an order list, you could only have 1 and then you have 2. So it forces individuals to decide what is most important.
Right. And maybe it's 1A and 1B, but it's still going to be distinct, right? Okay, so description, an order, an understanding of size, commonly referred to as estimate. But I'm intentionally using those words because all I need is an understanding of how big it is. All right, there's many well, maybe not many, but there's different ways we can estimate. There's even people who would prefer not to estimate. But if I don't understand, relatively speaking, hey, how big is this? Is it this big? Is it this big? As the product owner, how am I going to plan? How am I going to order? How am I going to understand the value if I don't understand how big is it? How am I going to understand the budgetary impact? I also have another reason for wanting to understand the size, and that is technical feasibility. So if I can get some technical people, even if it's a high level ballpark, give me an understanding of how big this is. That means they've been able to process the feasibility of what I'm asking for. If I ask for something and they say, I have no idea how big that is, no idea. We've never done anything like that before. I don't even know if it's possible. I need that type of information. If no one's looked at it to give me that type of feedback, how am I going to know that? So I'm looking for those three things. And Ernesto, when I'm done, if you want to carve off here and talk about no estimating, we can do that too. I'm looking for those three things. Now, there is an expectation that we can get this fourth thing, which is an understanding of the value. You might even call that priority, right, Ernesto? An understanding of the value. And what I mean by that is sometimes it's written down, sometimes it's verbally expressed, but the product owner, the product manager, right, needs to be able to communicate the importance. Why is this number one instead of number five? And then there's other things we can add to that. We can add things like acceptance criteria and such. That makes sense. But if I can't get those three basic things, then I'm not ready. Right? I got more work I have to do. What do you
I,
say?
I, I love those. I absolutely love those. And I have a total of five on my own. Those three being critical. Those three acceptance criteria. You mentioned, hey, look, you don't want to get to that point yet because you're going to save that for the last step in your refinement process. I'm completely fine with that. But if we're going to go through what it means to have a ready product backlog item or a refined product backlog item, I would want to know what you're going to look for when this is done, right? That acceptance criteria, what you mentioned, or the testable type of things, or the demonstratable aspect of what we're creating. I think that's an important one. And we have Jay on, who actually asked a very, very timely question. And that is, I have a project with many dependencies on tech and business sides. One change on either side breaks the other's workflow. How do we make progress when both sides changes need to be timed together? And that, I said, it was very timely because my fifth one is an understanding of dependency for
Mm,
what it means to be able and ready to develop these items, right? So not that all must exist, but having those elements in a product backlog gets us to a state where we now have a pretty good understanding of the what and the how, and we might be ready to get to the keyboard or to whatever type of product we're working on.
wow. Yeah. And did we have a discussion on dependencies already? I mean, that question that we just heard, um, adding a dependency indicator or reference on the product backlog, really helpful. Really, there's lots of things we can add. We can add risk assessment, all kinds of things we can add. Um, but then it's the whole other discussion about, okay, great. I put down, I recognize that we have a dependency. Oh, well, now what do we do with it? Because it's going to break things. Now, how do we coordinate together? I'm not sure how far we can get into that here, Ernesto.
I think Jay deserves an answer. If we could give him a short version of what we would do in that scenario, it might help him get through the challenge he's facing now. What would you say to that? So he's got a scenario where there's business needs and there's the technical development and there are dependencies from both sides. And then when you move one, you actually move the other, and it seems to break the entire process.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly going to be all about coordination. What the next question I'd want to ask is that other area that's going to break, right? If you make this change, are they following a similar agile approach that you're following, or are they completely separate from the agile model with their own project plans, maybe like a vendor, right? They're not even part of your organization, right? So I view them very differently, because in the first case, if they are aligned on things like iterative delivery and the way we plan together, then we can pursue some things like, hey, in our product backlog refinement discussion, we need to allocate time with the two different team representatives. Okay, how are we going to handle this? Let's work through the technical details of how we're going to do this. We thought we can do it in 2 weeks, but now it's actually going to take maybe 2 or 3 iterations because of this dependency. And how are we going to make sure that we cover those bases? And now you can get into something like, maybe, again, I'm going to use a Scrum term, but something like a Scrum of Scrums, a daily checkpoint or a periodic checkpoint, where the two teams, as the iteration is progressing, right, they're communicating with each other daily, if necessary, on their progress and what obstacles are they facing, and how can they continue to maintain that coordination effort throughout. The other case, if you're dealing with, let's take the extreme case, like an external vendor, they've got their own processes, and when you change something, it's going to break something on their end, and they're not beholden to your approach, right? Their contract allows them to work any way they want. And if you go to them and say, hey, we want to change this, could you tell us what the impact's going to be? You might have to wait a couple of weeks before you get an answer. And then when you get the answer, you might not be happy with it, because it could be like, oh, yeah, well, if you want us to do that, it's going to take us 2 months. Now, you can do this in 2 days. But unfortunately, you're tied to that vendor contract. Unless you can get management to change it, you're going to have to wait that 2 months for that vendor. Now, it doesn't always have to be that way, right? Because you can view that as an obstacle, and in the background work through, how can we make this better? Maybe for the next time, we have to suffer through it now, but we can't operate like this on a regular basis. So in either case, there's a lot of coordination and communication that's going to be required. So even if the parties are not aligned with the high visibility of an agile model, the only way you're going to be able to overcome that type of dependency is by building in some expectation of ongoing frequent communication. Ernesto, I feel like I just dumped a whole bunch of stuff, like, really
And there's a
quickly.
lot in there. We could do an entire session on that, but I think that there was a significant amount of value in that, because these are very layered type of topics, right? It's hard to separate them because we're dealing with a systems thinking. We're dealing with not only a system, we're dealing with a complex system. In fact, what Jake described is the very definition of a complex system, where we fix one variable in place, but the fact that it's influenced by the other variables, we now are trying to hit a moving target. So what we try to do is to try to normalize that as much as possible, and knowing that we are never going to get it fully fixed. But at the time of execution is the closest time when we're going to get it closer to its reality, right? That was a lot packed in there. But the idea that we have this is a multivariate problem that we constantly are addressing in an Agile setting.
Oh yeah, and there's another question posted. We didn't even get to this other consideration. So there's should I read the question, Ernesto?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. How can we effectively balance the need for innovation with managing technical debt on an extra large backlog? So let's come back to Jay's question about the dependencies. So you got this case where you can, take care of a certain aspect in a couple of days, but because of your vendor, and there we go. Jay is like, yeah, exactly. External vendors. It's going to take a couple of months, right, for them to do it. And I suggested, hey, will it always be that way? If there's something you could do in the background to change the relationship, talk to management, look at the contract, all those heavy lifting things. But what about the things you can control for the next time? So when you're talking to that worst case external vendor, 2 months, 2 days, as part of whatever it is you're creating, can you use the opportunity to say, hey, if we change the way we interface with each other, if we use a different approach, if we allow for some variables now instead of some of these hard-coded things that you require of us, we might be able to be a little more effective the next time something like this happens, and then make an assessment. Do you want to spend that time and money on that? Now, the question posted, managing technical debt. I would, in the example I just gave, I don't know if that case is technical debt or is it more refactoring, right? It's working. It's working. It's clumsy. It's ugly, but it's working. Let's make it better, right? Let's not change what the external layer sees, but under the covers, let's make that better. So that's more of a refactoring thing. When it comes to something like innovation, how do you balance innovation with technical debt? I can be really nasty about that and just say, well, why do you have technical debt in the first place? But I won't do that. And so you do have technical debt. How are you going to manage that in that large backlog? Hey, so a really simple technique that requires a lot of visibility and approval and communication. Is it serious enough where you want to allocate time during your iteration for innovation? Is it serious enough that you want to allocate time in your iteration to address those nasty technical debt items? In fact, Ernesto, if I remember my SBC training, like the SAFE model even has, a case where like, hey, reserve the last iteration of your quarter for that type of stuff, to do all the cleaning and all those types of things. So there's a framework that even has it built into it, right? Sorry, Ernesto, I feel like I'm dumping all this stuff. Go
And
ahead.
it's because it's coming at us from every direction, right? With folks having questions and these topics being layered or being connected. I think this is great. This is perfect. I want to go back real quick and give Jay a very clean, quick answer as well. We gave him the long answer, and he seems to be happy. But I want to also introduce, because it must be said, right? Why do these dependencies exist? Have you tried to reduce the dependency? Step number one in this troubleshooting or solving this problem. So the concept of a cross-functional team is central to Agile and to Scrum. The idea that can we put these individuals together in a room, whether that's virtual or physical, working daily, so that they are now becoming a cross-functional team that has everything they need to deliver your product increment. And better to have multiple sets of those cross-functional teams than it is to have multiple component teams that have to come together. That's when the dependencies become greater. So number one, can you create more cross-functionality? And in fact, there's a zero number there, right? So I'll give you 0, 1, and 2, just so I can put something behind that one. And that is, do you have a product owner on the team that is representing the business? That's the primary function of the product owner in a Scrum team. So I would wonder if you have business representation sitting and working with the developers on a daily basis, AKA the product owner. If you're missing that role, you're going to be having a significant amount of decision delays, this is what it sounds like, that there's decision delays and dependencies that are needed in order to get the information for developers or engineering to work with. And I'll give you data. We've been doing some data dropping here. So decision delay, as per the Standish report, again, has shown that there is a significant difference between teams that are able to make a decision within 5 hours and teams that have to delay decisions further than that. If you cannot make decisions within 5 hours, according to the study, the success rate is approximately 18% for those projects that have decision delayed. Whereas the success rate for teams that are empowered to make decisions and are cross-functional enough to make these decisions within 5 hours is 58%. We go from 18% to 58% by the fact that we have everybody we need in order to make that decision. That product owner is the decision delay reducer from the business on the Scrum team. So make sure you have that.
Wow,
Yeah.
Ernesto, that's like almost mind-boggling, and yet it makes so much sense. Why do we have this expectation in our agile frameworks, right, that we meet every day with the business? Why is the Agile Manifesto one of the principles, right? Say that business owners and developers, in quotes, they need to meet every day. And some people, when they hear, they're like, every day, I'm too busy. I don't get time for this, because every day is an opportunity to stay ahead of what's going to happen the next day, right? If you can solve problems within 5 hours, that's pretty much a work day for many people. No, I work 8 hours. Yeah, but you're probably only focused about 5. So what that study for me is telling me is like, hey, if you can make your decisions within a day, within that day, you're probably going to be a lot more successful.
And a lot of folks may not have that luxury, understanding the reality of the business, right? There's a third scenario to this, and that is that you have a vendor that is external, or you have a barrier that is keeping you from having that daily interaction that would be ideal. In that case, we take a page from good old US government, going back again to the idea that government realized, right? This is where the Agile BS analysis comes from, Peter, that if you want to go agile, the people you are doing business with must speak and act in a similar way. So the idea that you should be nudging those vendors to act in an agile manner or to be agile. And now we have a potential Scrum of Scrum or a multi-team coordination, but both sides being agile allows for that coordination to happen much easier. So three layers there, right? At the individual level, at the team level, and at the multi-team level. Hopefully, there's something to grab onto there. Right?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm still laughing at the Agile BS because like many of those listening today can probably testify to this. If you're an Agile organization and you're partnering with a vendor, and you tell your vendor that you're an Agile organization, there's a good chance your vendor is going to tell you they're also Agile. But are they really? I've run into too many cases where it's claimed to be aligned with agility. But unfortunately, it was really just to get the deal. They have some surface practices that look like it might be. Dig under the covers. If you have the ability to do that, because if you don't do it beforehand, you're going to find out real quick whether
all I have to do is go to Jimmy and, hey, Jimmy, you were a project manager up until this point. You are now a Scrum Master. Yes, we're Agile, so we can bid, right? And that's what that meter tried to address. And what does it mean to be Agile? And that's a pretty layered question that requires a lot of thinking and agreeing. Yeah. Makes it very interesting. Going to the topic of technical debt, I've actually had a few instances about this. How do you manage this in such a way that it's real for the organizations to gain value out of being agile, but at the same time paying back some of that? In other words, the idea that, hey, we've got so much stuff that we need to change and address and refactor and work with, that engineering is breathing and architecture is breathing down our necks, but we're also committed to the customer and we need to deliver the new feature. So how do we balance that? And I usually go to a grid that allows us to have the conversation simply about what percentage of capacity we want to allocate for the different types of work. There's no wrong answer here. The wrong scenario is not agreeing, right? And that we can have a divide that addresses things that we've made in the past and things that are in the future. In other words, and then there's another line that breaks it into a quadrant, and that line is for the platform and the individual product. So now what we have are 4 places where we can say, hey, look, this is how much percentage we're going to allocate for bugs. This is how much percentage we're going to allocate for re-architecting or restructuring or refactoring. And on the front end of it, on the future, this is how much we're going to allocate to innovation. And this is how much we're going to allocate for a new architecture that we want to build. You might have 1 or 2% in one and 98% on the other. That's okay. But agreeing to it is the first step to now having a product backlog that is going to allow us to address the things that are most important to us. And I think now we're getting back on track, looking at the time, Peter, where we can take that and help folks understand how do we now take this large list of items that have been put in the order that we prefer, and that the top items are the most important ones to us. But we've got business breathing down our necks and saying, hey, I need to understand by when you are developing and releasing 3.0 so that we can commit to our clients on a date. Very fair question. And we're looking at this product backlog and saying, oh, that's 1,200 product backlog items we need to estimate in order to give business an answer. Oh, okay, how long is it going to take us to get that estimation? About 2 months. Oh, they were hoping to get this in 2 days. So let's talk about some of those techniques and what we can offer folks in that regard.
Well, oh my goodness, how much time do we have, Ernesto? Yeah, this next release, we want to get it out. Now, I think it's probably reasonable to say that when the customer said, when our internal business reps said, hey, the customer needs this 3.0, they need a date, it's probably reasonable to expect that you don't have a 3-inch thick requirements document that explains all those things that would be needed for 3.0. The customer, the business, they probably have their own list of things. That's your start of your product backlog, right? So now we could take that list, and if they don't have a list, okay, then we're going to have to start making one together, right? And start having that conversation about, well, what's number one, what's number two? And one of the things that you might hear is like, well, it doesn't matter, it all has to get done anyway. Like, no, we understand that. But if we can also understand the order, right, that will allow us to bring more visibility early on so we can get more feedback, right, as we go. The things that are further out in order, maybe those things have higher level estimates. The things that are closer.
I was going to reinforce that with a, I don't know what you will say, Peter, but I'm going to put you in the scenario of the customer. You are that customer, and I am going to give you an alternative to get a 3.0 version in the amount of time that we will need, and I'll tell you what that is over time. Or I can give you a 2.1, 2.2, 2.3 until we get to a satisfactory 3.0. Which one would you choose? And those 1 points are going to be frequent, whereas the full version will be a bulk long term.
Yeah, and you might have to explain to me what that means, Ernesto, because I'm thinking in 3.0. I have no idea what you're talking about with 2.1, 2.2. I don't know what that means to my business. I have no idea what that means. I'm guessing it's going to require a little more conversation for me to understand why would I be interested in 2.1, 2.2. I'm looking at my plans for 3.0. I got my marketing team ready. I got my customer service people going through training. I don't even know if I want 2.1 or 2.2 because it's going to be more disruptive for me.
Yeah, great point. The idea that we can offer you a view into what 3.0 could look like, but we can give you a more detailed, and in fact, you would validate that what we've created in 2.1 is something that would meet your expectations. And we move into 2, and we move into 3. I find that approach increases the communication, creates a more valid product that meets expectations, and it also gets us to be able to build this cadence of managing the product backlog in such a way that it becomes dynamic as we learn and adapt.
Yeah, strongly agree. And thank you for role playing a little with me. Although you could have been a little bit tougher about it. So
Never.
so
Not with you, Peter.
so here's another variable that I've encountered. The customer reluctantly agrees to 2.1, 2.2, but they don't want to put it into the production environment. They want to wait. Okay, but I can still show you. Here's 2.1. It's in our test system, in our development environment, wherever it is. Can you have some of your people look at it? And can at some point can we say, yeah, 2.1 is good. Let's build on that now to make 2.2. And now progressively, as you're going, at any point on the way, you've got a good version of something. Not everything, but it's been approved, if you will, right? That they agree, yeah, that works. Okay, let's see what's coming up next. Now, if you can get them to understand the benefit of that, if you can then get them to come to iteration reviews, like sprint reviews, like, hey, it's going to take us, let's just make this up. It's going to take us 3 months to make 2.1, right? Every couple of weeks, we'd like to show you our progress. Now, that could be a new concept to the customer. So you already worked with them to get them to see the benefit of 2.1. You negotiate on that. Now, can you get them to see the benefit of, hey, could you send someone every couple of weeks? We're going to demonstrate for you what we've got, get some feedback from you, make sure that we're on track, for 2.1. I have found that to be the most valuable contribution in getting the customer more on board with this model by giving them that early and frequent visibility. In the beginning, it might even seem like a pain, like, oh, another meeting I have to go to. But if you do this well in a thoughtful manner, right, and show what's going to interest the customer, then you can draw them in, right, and have them looking forward to seeing those iterative deliveries.
Now, it occurred to me, Peter, we are talking about ideal scenarios where we have access to the customer, we have an open-minded customer that we're communicating with. The reality of what I normally face are internal alignment issues within the organization. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Hey, look, Ernesto, we already know what we need to deliver to the customer. We don't need to talk to that person. Red flag number one, but let's get past that and let's meet you where you are. What we do need is for the developers to work on the things that are going to get this thing delivered. And I don't see that happening right now. They're working on technical things and we need new features, right? So we talked about the grid and we talked about some of the techniques that are going to help us do that. But really, we spend quite a bit of time aspect of here's the entire list of the things that we need. I'm going to reference your thick book. And we need you to tell us when you're going to deliver that. Now, there's the pushback from engineering or development or product development that is saying, in order for us to tell you that, we need to estimate this stuff. We need to understand a lot of things here. This is going to take us some time. We don't have a lot of time. We need you to tell us how much time, or you estimate how long it will take for it to take place. And this is where the individuals that are having this conversation tend to buckle. And say, oh, yeah, not a problem. We'll have it for you in 4 months. Haven't spoken to anyone in development yet. The engineering is about to get a shot in the arm that they're going to be eating pizza for the next 4 months at night and burning the midnight oil. Not the situation we want, right? This is internal dysfunction within the organization. We haven't even brought in the customer into the picture yet, which is significant. But let's try to address that scenario, which is a very common one, I would imagine, to many folks listening.
Matter of fact, I think there's a question in the chat. How do we get our teams to practice some of these techniques? You're talking about the customer, but now you're saying, well, hold on a second, our own people, might have a challenge with this. Ernesto, right off the bat, for some of us, the whole idea of estimating is almost a Well, uncomfortable at best, right? An uncomfortable experience, frightening at worst, because they operate in an environment where they know those estimates are going to be abused and misused. So, we can talk about, okay, how are we going to do that? But if we don't address what people do with those estimates, then we're going to just constantly be burned over and over again. And I think this is one of the reasons for the no estimates movement, right? I've heard someone part of that community say, hey, look, I'm part of no estimates because, from my experience, there is no good that comes from estimating the work. It's all bad. People get expectations, they write contracts based on it, etc., etc. So that in itself is a big cultural hurdle, right? What does that communication mean? Um, the other consideration I would suggest is that if we do have to estimate it, and I don't mean to make it seem like all estimation requests are drudgery or fraught with fear. They can be embraced in a very healthy manner, right? If we are being asked to estimate a large amount of work in just a couple of days, there are some speedy techniques, for doing that. And I don't know if that's where you were headed with this, Ernesto. Am I like on a track of where you're thinking? We could talk about that.
Always.
Okay. So there's something like affinity estimating. And affinity estimating is where you have, and there's different ways you could do this, but there's a large amount of work. And you're asking your technical people to categorize that work, each piece of that work, into groupings. Well, these items over here, they're on the smaller side, and these items over here, they're on the larger side, and these items here, they're kind of in the middle, and then we get these other items here that we don't even know what to say about them, because we can't understand what's really being requested. We can't estimate them. And now, to do this, you need to have people that can somehow align on what small means, right? If we're going to group things together into a category of work that generally is considered on the smaller side, in the beginning, we probably have to have some more detailed conversation around that. We might even have some examples. Well, here's a few examples of what something that is small would look like. And here's a few examples of something that is large. Right? And again, different techniques to do this. But from my experience in this, though, I have found that if you can get a team of people to focus on this, you can go through a large number of items in a relatively short period of time. Dozens of items, maybe even hundreds of items in hours or days.
Try 1,030 minutes. One case study show.
Wow. See, I haven't seen it that phenomenal, but that's very encouraging.
Yeah.
1,000.
And this was based on the bucket system with the columns holding the different product backlog items and being placed by the team members with one round of adjustments and ending up with what actually was a very useful initial estimate of a very, very large product backlog.
Wow. Now, I imagine, Nestor, would you mind commenting? I imagine that these are, maybe I'm wrong, people that probably have some experience working together, some experience with the domain. They didn't just walk in off the street, I'm guessing.
No, this is a seasoned team that tried a different alternative to estimating. They did have a product backlog that was building over time. It had gone too large. They needed to have an understanding of what they had in front of them or ahead of them. And this was a technique that they used in order to get that understanding. All team members that were already, number one, familiar with the project and the product and working together, understanding each other. Yes,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. Phenomenal. And I also draw a connection to this with like the wisdom of crowds, right? Because there's studies done on this too, right? That when you get a group of people together that are relatively relatively experienced. They have some experience, right? And they respect each other, right? They will tend to come up with better estimates regardless of the technique. I shouldn't say regardless, but there's different techniques. They could discuss it, they could do it silently, but they'll tend to align with estimates that tend to be more accurate. Now, I do need to comment on that word accurate. What we're looking for now, continuing with this conversation, what we're looking for is accuracy over precision. Accuracy, what are the odds that we're right? So we put something into the bucket that's on the relatively small size. What are the odds that that's right? Probably pretty good. Accuracy, that's a representation of accuracy. Oh, but exactly how many hours is each one of them going to take? No, that's a precision question. And if you ask me to get down to that degree of precision, the odds of me being correct are probably going to go way down. So can we start with an understanding of, yeah, generally small, generally large? Let's start there. And then as we go, right, we can start getting into some more precision, maybe over the next couple of sprints or the next couple of months, but not, 2 years worth of precision.
And that's it, right? That Pareto is back, right? Focusing on those items that are more closer to execution and spending more time on that. And so we have one technique, and that's the affinity or bucket aspect. Then there's planning poker, which takes longer but has a lot more discussions and allows us to now begin to truly dive into the weeds about what it'll be like in terms of delivering this. So we talk about the how more specifically. Bucket techniques, t-shirt sizing, right? There's also dot voting to encourage the wisdom of the million eyeballs, as you mentioned, Peter. So there are many techniques. All, however, having a particular strength and some disadvantages, right? In that scenario of affinity, well, you could see how discussion didn't quite happen, right? It was all estimating based on the allocations, and now we have an initial idea where things might be.
Yeah.
So keeping these things in mind, but also avoiding anchoring. So in fact, Peter, I think what we could do here is have a whole other session on estimating. We were discussing product backlog management, and of course, estimation is a big part of that and something that a lot of folks have questions about. So we segue into it, but it's its own topic on its own. It has many, many, many layers to consider. So how about that, Peter? How about we commit to coming back to a session where we talk about estimation, the advantages and disadvantages of that?
I think we could, and I think it would be reasonable if when we come to another session on estimating, we can also sprinkle it with some additional techniques for large backlog management, because there's some other things, right, that probably fit well with an estimation discussion.
I love that. There are a couple of questions that I think we can answer in a jiffy, and that's, what training classes cover this material in more detail? This type of product backlog management falls in the wheelhouse of the product owner with the assistance of the teams and understanding the techniques, but a Scrum Master could also benefit from coaching, or a product owner can benefit from the coaching that a Scrum Master could offer. So I think you'll find these topics in the Scrum Master class, and then diving into details about the techniques in the product owner class. If you're doing a scaling class, then that teaches you at a large scale how to do that with a multi-team type of combination, right? And how can we get teams to practice some of these techniques? Well, that's a tall order, right? We read how to ride the bike, but getting on the bike and pedaling away, it's an entirely different experience, right? I think a lot of that has coaching in it, and doing it on the job with someone that is assisting the individual and the teams to make sure that they don't fall into anti-patterns. A Scrum Master, a well-seasoned Scrum Master, is expected to do this, should know how to do this, but if that's not the case for whatever reason, then bringing in an external coach to assist with it. Maybe it has the shape of a workshop where individuals are working through those items in a way that is building up to creating the ready product backlog that we talked about. Anything I might have missed on those two, Peter?
And we also offer specific topic training opportunities, right? So custom, right? So like, hey, I'd like to have a session with my team about estimating, let's say. We can do that also.
I love that. So we've come up to the hour marker, which is what we originally scheduled. Peter and I joked that when you and I get together, we can do this for hours. We can geek about this stuff forever. So Peter, thank you so much for another great session with a lot of valuable information. I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to send out a shout out to Marcelo. I see some comments here from Marcelo. Thank you for the kind words, Marcelo, and the reinforcement in some of the topics we were discussing. And for those of you that submitted your questions as well, we will see you soon again in our live session. Thank you, everyone.